Hyman Rickover was an admiral in the United States Navy. Not only that, he directed the original development of the naval nuclear propulsion and controlled its operations for 3 decades. He was often asked to, or people thought he needed to be removed, but he was in there for a long time until President Reagan finally retired him. But in this admiral, you can read a lot about him. You can read about how he designed these submarines, how he inspected them. But there's so many stories, which some of them may be folklore at this point, of how he would inspect those whom he hired to lead in these nuclear submarines. There's a tale that's spoken of him. It's also mentioned of Henry Ford. And so whether or not it's entirely true, because he would never exactly say this, but much is written from people who say they experienced it, it brings out a great lesson. Here's what happened. A PCO. I thought in the Baptist world we had a lot of acronyms, but then I tried to figure out the Navy. A prospective commanding officer, a PCO, was having dinner with Rickover at this steak restaurant. The steaks arrive and the PCO immediately put salt and pepper on his steak before he took a bite. Rickover stood up. He says, "The meeting is over." The PCO asked, "What happened?" And Rickover said, "Any man that immediately jumps to conclusions, despite not knowing all the facts, cannot command a nuclear power submarine." Listen, assumptions can be dangerous. When you make assumptions about something, they could be dangerous. The passage we're going to study today has 2 accounts. You know both of them. You've heard them, you've read them, you've probably studied them before. Jesus calming the storm, and then Jesus casting demons out of a man, putting them into pigs, off the cliff. You've heard these. Both of these contain someone, or more than someone, being fearful. We see in chapter 4, verse 40, verse 41, that there is fear involved in the disciples. Chapter 5, verse 15, we see that there are people who respond in fear to what they saw Jesus do. And listen, fears are almost always predicated by assumptions. You assume something, so you start to feel a certain way. For example, you assume you're going to be fired when your boss asks you to meet with him, so you start to feel fearful of that meeting. Another example, you assume that every serious relationship you're going to get in is going to lead to hurt like the last one did, so you're afraid to move into any new relationship. Fears are often predicated by assumptions. And fears can be overwhelming because they're often fueled by our own thinking about a situation, whether our thinking is true or not. We're going to see in these 2 accounts that we have to have a different focus in order to not let fear paralyze us. So we're going to talk about having a fearless faith in Christ. So let me read Mark 4. Let me take the first account, starting at verse 35. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Now, just in that account, we'll get to the next one soon, but there are 3 questions in this account. There's 4 actually, but 2 are connected. There are 3 questions in this account, and really, these 3 questions are going to serve as an outline for this sermon. We're going to look at these 3 questions because they're asked and they ought to be answered. Not only by those who were there, not only by Jesus, by the disciples, but these are questions you and I may ask at some point in our lives, or questions that we need to ask, and we need to know the answers. These questions get to the heart of what's going on in both accounts, the storm and the demon-possessed man. Here's the three questions. Here's our outline. Number one, do you not care that we will perish? Question two questions really. Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? And question three, who is this? Those are our three questions. Do you not care that we will perish? Isn't it ironic that the carpenter is less fazed by the stormy sea than a boat of fishermen? Do you not care that we will perish? The disciples' first question is what seems to be the default question that many people take in fearful times. Many people would rather accuse God of not caring for them or even accuse God of negligence instead of facing situations with the peace that comes from having a faith in God. Remember, fears are almost always predicated by assumptions. So what's the assumption here? Do you not care that we're perishing? That question reveals the assumption that the disciples assumed that Jesus did not care about them. Isn't that what so many people who go through suffering, so many people that struggle in a variety of ways, isn't that a very common question our flesh wants to ask? God, don't you care about me? And then it's expressed this way. Then why would such and such happen? Do you not care that we will perish? What's interesting is in Mark's account, what we just read here, the disciples did not wake Jesus to ask him to do anything about the storm. They were more worried that he didn't seem to care about them, that he thought he should be sleeping versus coming up there and caring about these other men that are all panicked in this boat. Now Matthew records the disciples saying, "Save us." So there certainly could have been in the disciples, they knew what Jesus had done. They see a storm, they see pending danger, and they look at Jesus and wake him and say, "Don't you care that we're perishing? Save it. Do something about this," is what they're saying. At this point, the disciples have seen Jesus do miraculous things. We've been studying them as Mark's been writing about them. But even though they've seen Jesus do miraculous things, there was no focus on Jesus as their sovereign creator. The disciples developed self-centered assumptions. Don't you care about us? And those self-centered assumptions were influencing sinful responses from them. Now, Jesus' sleeping is not just a way that Mark is telling us that Jesus was fully human. Yes, he slept. He had to. He rests. And do you realize that rest has always been part of the work of our sovereign God? Think of the creation account. And when he lays his head down in this boat, Jesus the Son is trusting God the Father with whatever was going to happen. Jesus' rest is certainly contrasted with the disciples' chaos, their panic. Are you quick to accuse God or to attack him during challenging times in your life? Or will you enter those challenges with a posture of peace and dependence on God? That's the first question. Jesus asks the second question, why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? Now the disciples are learning a lot about Jesus, but it seems that they still at this point in Mark's account do not have a genuine faith in Jesus Christ. Because Jesus says, have you still no faith? Notice that word, have you still no faith? As much as they'd seen Jesus do, as much as they'd been around him and heard him teach, they still question whether he cares enough about them to save them. I mean, imagine this. They've been walking now with Jesus for a little while. They've been seeing His miracles. They've been listening to His teaching. They've seen Him do incredible things, and they are still worried that He doesn't care about them, or that He doesn't have power enough to save them. Have you still no faith? Now let's make this very practical. Some will continue to reject Jesus Christ even though the evidence is all around them. People do this all the time. People you know don't believe in Jesus Christ even though it's really obvious. They wake up every day, they have evidences of God's grace. We call that common grace. You can see history, archaeology, science continually verifying the truth of the Bible. You can see the validity of the Bible is proven more so than any other piece of literature. But yet there will be those who reject Jesus even though the evidence is around them. Now, just like the disciples here, they have no reason to doubt God's goodness to them or His ability to save. They have no reason to doubt that. But just like them, there will be people still who only have a knowledge about the Lord, but never have faith in Him. We know that knowing about Jesus is not the same as knowing Jesus. I was reminded last week, I'm in a parking lot. And of all the places to have a conversation with a stranger, some man walks over, we cross paths, and he started talking to me. And I could tell very quickly that this was going to be a very easy conversation to talk about the Lord, because he was talking to me about his leukemia that he was suffering. And we talked for a while, and I just listened to him, and he was explaining things, and I knew I wanted to witness to him. I wanted to share the gospel, and I did. I made it as quick and plain and clear as I could. And I said to him, I said, have you ever put your faith in Jesus Christ? And here's what he said, and I know you've heard stuff like this. He says, hey, you don't know what I've done. God would never forgive me. Do you hear that? God could never forgive me. Is there anything that God cannot forgive? Is there anything outside of His power to save? Or Isaiah says, is His arm too short to save this man in the parking lot? But that's how people think. Oh, you don't know how bad I've been. Man, Lord, no, I could never make it to heaven. No, you couldn't, but Jesus Christ made it available for you. Some only have a knowledge, but they never step into faith. They never trust. Let's go to Mark 5. Let's keep reading. Then they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes, and when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain, for he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirits." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs, let us enter them." So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. Verse 14, the herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country, and people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there clothed in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs, and they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. And he did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. Now, in contrast to the disciples, this demon-possessed man who was living in hopelessness, he saw Jesus from afar. Now, the tombs often would have been out of the city a little bit. They were often up in a hill region, maybe a little mountainous area. It very well could have been that this man who was demon-possessed had some elevation and he could look out over and see this boat coming. It could be that this man was seeing the storm and saw the storm immediately calmed by some man in a boat. But what we absolutely know is he saw Jesus when Jesus comes up on that shore and he goes to him from afar. This man makes his way to Jesus. And what did he do? It says he runs to Jesus and he fell down before him. What's the contrast with the disciples? Well, this man didn't run to Jesus and say, "Why don't you care about me? Why am I being tormented and ostracized?" He didn't ask him that. He didn't accuse him. But he ran to Jesus in a posture of surrender and worship. He went to Jesus with faith despite his horrible circumstances. Now, it can be a little tricky when you read this chapter, this account here, because Jesus is actually interacting with the demons who were speaking out from this man. Jesus ultimately cast them into a herd of pigs. Now, can you imagine 2,000 pigs? Like 2,000 pigs. Even if they weren't doing anything but being pigs, that's a spectacle alone. I mean, there's smells involved in that. There's all kinds of things involved in that. But can you imagine 2,000 pigs all of a sudden running off a cliff? Like sometimes you read the Bible and you're just like, okay, I wish there was a couple more details. Like, how long did it take? We're not going to go test this hypothesis here at all, but how long did it take for 2,000 pigs to fall off a cliff? I mean, was this like one by one? Were they in a single file line? Were they in all at once? Here we go, What I'm trying to say is this is a public spectacle. This went from being a one-on-one interaction between Jesus and a man, and now everyone in the city is like, what's going on over there? And so they go find out. The herdsmen went, they told people, they all came to see what happened, and there's Jesus, and then there's this crazy man, but now he's sitting next to Jesus in his right mind. And what were they? They were afraid, it says. Shouldn't they be thankful? Shouldn't they be happy, rejoicing? Like, why were they afraid? Why would you be afraid? Well, this is a pretty big display of power here. Something happened that usually doesn't happen, and now this guy that nobody could subdue. Here's the assumption. Remember, fears are often predicated by assumptions. The assumption is Nothing in this world is powerful enough to subdue this man. But now, he's sitting in his right mind next to whoever this is, who also just happened to send 2,000 pigs off a cliff. Why are they afraid? Because they have this assumption no one can subdue the most powerful man in the world. But now they're standing before him. Who is this? Who is this? What's really interesting to me, did you catch at the end of this account? They did not welcome Jesus into their town. They asked him to leave the region. They asked him to leave the region. Like it's one thing to get kicked out of the house. Maybe it's still one thing to get kicked out of the town. Like, we just want you out of the entire region. Like, just be gone. And here's a really important lesson in all of this. Maybe they were fine with the idea of this man who used to be tormented being okay. Maybe they were okay with that. But this is the Decapolis we're talking about, which is a collection of about 10 cities. These were Gentile cities. Somebody just lost a lot of their livelihood. Jesus, you're interrupting our comfort. Jesus, you're disrupting the status quo around here. Listen, we don't just want you away, get back on it. We want you out of the region. And there's some people that live that way. Jesus, I'm happy with what I'm doing. Don't disrupt what I'm doing. I like my life. I want to live the way that I want to live. Just get out. Get out of the region. They didn't have faith because they feared that Jesus was going to interrupt or disrupt their status quo. See, some might not believe even though the evidence is clear. Some might not believe because they don't want to give up their comforts and their normal ways of life. But the wise will live by faith because they know who Jesus is and what He's done. Which is why we have to examine the final question. Back to the disciples, they say, who is this? Who is this? Ironically, the demons and the man from the Gerasenes knew better who Jesus was than His own disciples at this point. The demons called Jesus the Son of the Most High God. Chapter 5, verse 7. But all the disciples could call Him, chapter 4, verse 38, was teacher. Do you know that even the demons know God and even they shudder? Even they believe. They call Him Son of the Most High God and the disciples, teacher. But after they witness this miracle, back to the disciples, of Jesus controlling nature, they're filled with this awe-inspiring reverence type of fear. And then they ask this powerful question, who is this that even the wind and the sea obey Him? You see, that Jesus was teaching His disciples more of His own identity, who He was. And then as Mark's gospel continues, Jesus is acting to establish their faith more and more. And what does Jesus teach them in that moment at the end of chapter 4, what we read? What does He teach them on that boat, calming the storm? What is the lesson that the disciples are learning about the identity of Christ? It's this, is that He is Lord of all. That He is sovereign over all things because He's the creator of all things. Listen to Philippians chapter 2, verse 9 through 11. You've heard these, but listen. Therefore God has highly exalted Him and bestowed on Him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. Do you realize that Jesus Christ is sovereign over every dimension of creation? The demon-possessed man knew this. In chapter 5, verse 18, after he's healed, he begged Jesus to stay with him. He just wanted to be with Jesus. And what's interesting, again, you contrast this with the disciples, their lack of faith, and the demon-possessed man's faith. The contrast here is staggering. The man from the Gerasenes wants to truly follow Jesus. And Jesus would let him be faithful, but he does not permit him to stay with him. Jesus knew that he had these 12. He knew what he was going to do. He knew his ministry plan here. And he knew it wasn't right for this man to just stay with him. So instead, he sends him out to faithful service. This man from the Gerasenes might have been the first Gentile missionary. He sends him out, and here's what Jesus says: go, tell your friends what God has done for you. Isn't that the very, very simple task of a follower of Jesus Christ? Go tell what God has done for you. Go tell. I was sitting with a pastor a few weeks ago, and he's telling me his story. I hadn't met him before, and he tells me about years ago, as a young man, he says, I was in jail. He says, I just got arrested again. Got out, I got arrested again. I was facing at least 10, 15 years maybe. He says, I didn't know what I was going to do. I just was resorting to a life of prison. And this is a black man in the state of Mississippi in the 1980s. Just keep that context for a minute. He says he's in the jail, and there was this man who was a Gideon. He came in, he handed him a Bible. He says, for the first time, this man handed me the Bible. For the first time, I read some of it with him. He says, I knew then who Jesus was. He says, I put my faith in Jesus, and I was ready to live for Jesus even if I was locked up the rest of my life. He said the day came that he was supposed to stand before the judge, and the judge that he was supposed to go before somehow wasn't there that day. And he had a different judge, and that judge permitted a group of Gideons, a group of Gideons petitioned the judge to release this man into their care so that they could help him be successful in life. And that judge listened to them. And if you hear him tell his story, he says to be a black man in Mississippi in the 80s, released to some, and the way he describes them, released to some of these weird-looking white folks who call themselves Gideons. And they took him in, they discipled him, they trained him up, and now he's not just having a faithful ministry in the city where he's planted, but he's got international reach through a lot of what he's doing. See, here's this man. He said, when I started, all I knew was, go tell what God did for me. It's the most simple task. Go tell your friends what God has done for you. Because here's the reality. God's going to do it for them too. He can do it for them too. Jesus Christ is Savior. Jesus Christ is sovereign. And when we understand His identity, then we can start to live a fearless faith. Now remember that assumptions often predicate fear. And our assumptions might not be true. Our thinking, our feelings can often become so selfish, and we allow it to generate fear that will so often control us and even influence us to sinful responses. We have to realize, though, as we talk about fear, fear is a natural response that we experience when faced with certain situations. Fear is not inherently sinful. Fear often can protect us from danger. Fear often can motivate us to act wisely. How many of you did not do something stupid as a kid because you knew you'd have to face your parents? That's a good fear. That's a good fear. But fear can influence us to be sinful or to sin when we focus on the circumstances rather than on God and His promises in that. Unhealthy fear can hinder a person's ability to trust God and live out their faith. And so let's try to be very practical. Let me help us to think about how do we peel back all the layers of emotions that are wrapped up in fear. And we want to do this because we want to understand how we can seek Christ, how we can find peace, and ultimately how we can glorify Him. Now, I don't know about you, but often what our minds, when they play out assumptions, what it's like is this just a bunch of worst case scenario video clips that just keep playing in our minds. Okay? We start assuming and we start playing out. These aren't even good assumptions. We're often thinking of the worst case scenario type of situations. And there's often so many layers to a particular fear that you have that you're not even sure what you're really fearful of. So I want you to think about something that you fear. You don't have to say it out loud, but just think about something that you fear. And I want to use a common, very simple example. It certainly can be more complex than this. But I want to use a very common, very simple example that biblical counselors would use. And here's the example. Let's say a person has a fear of driving across bridges. Can anybody at least empathize a little bit? Okay. Somebody has a fear of driving across bridges. And it's gotten to the point where it's really, really hindered this particular person's life. And she will not go certain places. She will not enjoy certain things that she could because she will not go certain ways because there are bridges. All right, let's just imagine that's the scenario. Now, I want you to listen. I'm going to teach you a 2-word question that's going to help you to get to the heart of fear. Here's the question. It's 2 words. Then what? Okay, remember that. Then what? Let's play it out. Let's say we're talking to this lady. She is scared of bridges. She does not want to drive across them. She is trying to get over this. She's trying to find help. Here's what it might look like. You ask her to picture the bridge. You ask her to picture driving across the bridge. And you say, all right, now you're approaching the bridge. You're a mile away. You're getting very close. It's the only option you have to get from this place to that place. You're getting ready to cross the bridge. Okay, you're just a few feet from the bridge. Okay, what are you feeling now? Here's how it might go. She might say this, well, I'm so afraid, my heart is pounding, I'm breathing hard, I think I might pass out. Then what? Well, I do pass out. Then what? Then the car begins to swerve wildly. Then what? Then it smashes into the guardrail. Then what? Well, it jumps over the guardrail and starts falling down, down, down. Then what? It hits the bottom on the rocks below. Then what? Then I die. Then what? Well, I'm with the Lord. Well, can you handle that? Okay, now listen. This is very simple. It gets a lot more complex than this. When you ask, then what? You're pressing deeper and deeper. It's like you're just uncovering more and more layers of a person's heart to see what are they really fearful of. Now, there can be legitimate fears, we would say, or scenario situations to which she would be thinking, well, I won't be able to take care of my kids anymore. I won't be able to do this. What's my husband going to do? Those are good conversations. That's why this is more complex. Asking then what will reveal the deepest concern of your heart. But it also then helps you to apply the promises of God to those concerns. Because often when she's approaching that bridge, she might be like voicing some prayer, but is she truly thinking about her faith in the Lord? asking, then what? Trains you to focus on who God is in this circumstance. And it trains you not to let your mind wander through the endless assumptions and worst case scenario video clips running through your mind. Listen, the disciples should have felt a little bit of fear when they're on a boat and a really big storm comes. You would too. You'd start to get a little scared. You'd start to feel your blood pressure rise a little bit. You'd start to sweat a little bit. You'd feel that. That's fear. But the disciples went straight to panic instead of God's promises. If they had asked, then what? They certainly could have ended up in that scenario with, we're going to die. But the point in this account is that they did not have faith in Christ to trust Him and act wisely. They didn't trust Him and they went straight to panic. They didn't trust Him and then they resort to living as those who have no God. Having a fearless faith does not mean you'll never experience fear. You will. And having a fearless faith doesn't mean you should be stupid. I'm afraid of heights. I'm afraid of falling is really what it is. Like that's what afraid of heights is. I'm afraid of falling. The bridge thing, there's a very long bridge that if you are in Maryland and you ever go to Ocean City, there's a very long bridge. You have to go over it if you're going to go to the ocean, or else it's going to be like a 3-hour detour. Okay? You have to go over it. I don't like driving on bridges. I'm scared of heights. I've told you before, my brother and I, we went to a lake that had these jumping platforms, 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet. We stood at the 30 foot for 3 or 4 hours. Couldn't jump off. Scared. My top of my head was sunburnt really bad after that day. I don't like to fall, I guess. If I'm hiking up a mountain and I find myself on a path that has very little room for my feet and there's a dangerous drop right below, I don't just say, I'm going to keep going here, then I'm going to fall and I'm going to die and I'm going to be with the Lord. No, in James it says, if any of you lacks wisdom, ask God and He will give it to you. We're to be wise. Having a fearless faith doesn't mean be stupid. It means I'm going to stop going that direction of the hike. I'm going to look around and find a better path that I could perhaps walk on where I don't have as much a chance of falling off. You could think through many other scenarios. You could play out your fears, and maybe over lunch you'll do that. You'll rewind. Well, we don't even rewind anymore. You just start over. Play those video clips in your head. All the worst case scenario assumptions that are predicating your fears. You could do all of this and you could understand that a fearless faith, it means that we act with wisdom from God. But the point is that you won't have wisdom from God through fearful scenarios if you're consumed with your circumstances and you're not focused on Him. A fearless faith sounds a little challenging, doesn't it? I mean, can we really do this? Is there an example of having a fearless faith? Meaning, is there an example of how to submit that natural emotion of fear to the Lord and submit to the leadership of the Holy Spirit in that moment? There is. And I want to show you in Psalm 13. Will you turn there and we'll close with this. Psalm 13, David just unloads on God. I want to look at it with you. Is there an example of a fearless faith? We know that Jesus is sovereign over every dimension of creation. Psalm 13. To the choir master, a psalm of David. Six verses. Look at how he unloads on the Lord. How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Do you hear some of the disciples' first question in that? Do you not even care that we're going to perish? How long, O Lord? Verse 3, consider and answer me, O Lord my God, light up my eyes lest I sleep the sleep of death. Lest my enemies say, I have prevailed over him, lest my foes rejoice because I am shaken. Now look at verse 5. But I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. Do you see a fearless faith in David? There was some significant circumstances in his face. He's up against some things that he's just not sure. I mean, to say what he says in verse 3, you better keep my eyes open or I'm going to die. Listen, David goes from questioning the Lord to singing to the Lord. He goes from a place of fear and confusion to peace, contentment, and trust in God's identity and sovereignty. Listen, if you don't remember anything else, do this. If fear is getting the best of you, start singing. God can handle it. Tell him what you're experiencing. He can handle it. He already knows what's in your heart. If you sound horrible, he can handle that too. If fear's getting the best of you, sing praises to him. Because you know what happens when we sing praises to God? It reminds us of who he is. If you're singing praises to God, you're not focusing on your wretched self. You're not focused on your circumstances staring you down, telling you that you're not going to get past this. Sing praises to him. It'll remind you who he is. And then search his word for promises related to what you're experiencing. Maybe we should say, follow the example of the man from the Gerasenes. I love how he desires God's presence while faithfully going and doing God's work. That ought to be us. Not paralyzed by fears, but trusting a sovereign God, desiring his presence while faithfully going and doing his work. Could we follow the simple instruction? Go tell your friends what God has done for you.